Hi everyone, I hope life is treating you kindly. I'm Lubomira and thank you for joining me today. Welcome to all my crafty friends new and returning. I always look forward to this time of the week when we get together for some crafting fun. Now that you're here, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. By hitting that little bell, you'll get notified every time I post something new and you won't miss out on any of the crafty goodness. I hope everyone's doing well this week. Before I get into the video, I apologize for the very excited birds that may be in the background of my voiceover. Spring is in full swing in my yard, and the birds are very enthusiastic, especially when the cats are nearby. So please bear with me, even though it can be a little distracting. We've been having some amazing weather in my area, which was really nice because my husband and I just celebrated our anniversary this past week. We've been together for 17 years and married for 7. In that time, we've learned what pushes each other's buttons, but there is one thing that we just can't get on the same page, even after all these years. One of my least favorite things to do is text to have a conversation. I tend to give one-word answers or short phrases, the "I'm fine," "it's good," "okay" answers. These inevitably lead to "Are you mad at me?" or "Did I do something wrong?" text from my husband. No matter how many times I say I just don't like texting, we end up in the same pickle. Where did you get that I'm upset from "okay" or "that's fine" when you told me something? I bet I'm not the only one with these little pet peeves. I'd love to hear that I'm not. This card is partly inspired by that. I'm excited to share this project with you, so let's get into the video. Now this card is similar to the card I created last week in 2 ways. 1, I created an ink blended background with some torn masking tape, and 2, I used a stencil to create a subtle design in the background. Today's card shows you one other way of using a stencil besides its normal way. I began by masking off the perimeter of my panel using some torn masking tape. I ended up covering the edges of the panel completely to prevent any over blending, since I wasn't sure if I'd end up wanting to use the entire panel or cutting it down. In the end, it didn't matter since I did cut it down. Next, I ink blended a background using some Distress Oxide inks. To create this type of background, you should use a water-resistant ink. There's a few of them out on the market right now, including Distress and Distress Oxide. There is one other option for this technique that I'll share later on as I'm going through the steps, if you don't have a water-reactive ink. For this project, I used the colors Salvaged, Patina, Mermaid Lagoon, and Seedless Preserves. I started with the light turquoise, then moved on to the blue, and ended with the red-violet color. Once I had finished ink blending, I added some splatter to the panel using Picket Fence's Paper Splatter watercolors in the liquid gold and white snowflake colors. I usually watered these down, but someone asked me what was the difference between the watered down version and the as-is version. When you water the paint down, it gets a little bit more translucent because the pigment isn't as intense. If you leave it as is, the splatter is bolder, which you can hopefully see in this project compared to other ones I've done in the past. Either effect is pretty, and it's just about preference. I used my faithful old fan brush to apply the splatter, giving the project a healthy amount of paint. Now typically when using a stencil, you get the positive space left on your project by applying some sort of media and pushing it through the opening of the stencil. What I planned on doing is the opposite, highlighting the negative space. To do this, I simply spritzed the surface of my stencil with some water and then laid the stencil wet side down on top of my project. The water will activate the ink, lightening the background of the design while keeping the butterflies bolder. I lightly ran my fingers over the stencil, making sure to make good contact between the stencil and the surface of my panel. I keep the stencil in place for a few seconds, letting the water absorb and really activate that ink. As I mentioned, there is another way of using this technique if you don't have water reactive ink, and that's either by using some ink sprays or shimmer sprays. Next time, if you spritz a stencil with a spray ink or shimmer spray, don't wipe that stencil clean, but rather pop another panel over the spritz surface and pick up that leftover ink or spray to create another background. It's just another way of stretching those supplies and creating yet another version of a design you're using. I removed the stencil after a few seconds and let the water settle before moving on to the next step. Here comes my favorite part, removing that mask. I wasn't really patient with taking the mask off, and I ran the risk of getting some smudges. Luckily though, that didn't happen. Just keep in mind you are working with water, reactive ink, and fingers when handling your project. I was careful not to snag the cardstock as I was removing my mask. I'm not sure if my batch of mint tape lately is stickier than usual, but since the paper was damp, it tends to be a little bit more delicate and I didn't want to run the risk of tearing it. Another thing to keep in mind is that there may be a tiny amount of bleeding beneath the tape since the tearing makes it a little less water resistant. I don't mind this, it just adds a little bit more character to the masked edge. If you want to avoid excess bleeding, just dab the edges of the tape with a cloth to pick up the excess water as soon as possible. I trimmed down my panel by 1/4 inch all around and then trimmed a piece of black cardstock slightly larger than the ink blended panel to add as a matte border. I attached my ink blended panel to the black cardstock using liquid glue and then wiped any of the glue that seeped out from between the two panels with a cloth. I attached the finished panel to a white card base using foam squares and liquid glue. Before placing the panel, I used a black marker to cover the white core of the black cardstock by running the marker along the edge of the cardstock. For the sentiment, I chose sending a card instead of a text. This is probably my favorite sentiment in any of the Dollar Tree stamp sets, and you can use it for anything. You could also add to it to make it more specific and personalize it to any occasion. I placed the stamp into my stamping platform, treated the cardstock with an anti-static tool, and then stamped the stamp in clear embossing ink on a black piece of cardstock. Then I sprinkled white embossing powder over the wet ink and heat set it with my heat tool. When my sentiment was ready, I cut down my greeting using my trimmer. I tidied up the edges of the banner using a black marker, and then using a square to make sure it was straight, I applied the banner to the front of my card using foam squares and glue. To add a little bit more dimension to this card, I used some simple Dollar Tree butterfly stickers to coordinate with the background. The stickers are white and come with little pearls attached to them. I carefully removed the pearls from the centers and left the butterflies white, although you could easily apply color to them. Then I applied the butterflies to the front of the card, reinforcing them with some liquid glue. Lastly, I added some iridescent drops to the front of the card for that little extra sparkle. And that's it for this card. I really enjoyed making this card. Like last week's card, you could have just left the background as the main focal part of the card, but the simplicity of the white butterflies complements the design and doesn't take away anything from it. Overall, I really love this charming design. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you dropping by for some crafting fun. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did sharing it with you. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, please leave me those comments. I have such a nice time hearing from you all, and I look forward to it every week. I hope you'll join me next time for another project. Until then, have a beautiful week, and I hope life treats you kindly. See you soon. Bye.